Sarah, it is such a joy to have you on For Real. Thank you for taking the time to talk with me.
Oh, what a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You are speaking with me in a very different time zone. You live in Oxford, England,
Mhm.
and I don't, though I would like to in my heart, and to have a fireplace and wear an ascot and swirl sherry and quote Clive Staples Lewis. So, can we pretend just for the next half hour?
Absolutely. And come visit me in the vicarage someday.
Oh, if only I had a tattoo that said, "Come visit me in the vicarage." That just made my day. We don't even need to talk any further. But we are, because you have beautiful things to tell, to teach, to coach, to come alongside our listeners. Your new book is called Reclaiming Quiet, Cultivating a Life of Holy Attention. It comes out on election day this year. You just let me know. So that's a wonderful juxtaposition of quiet and not quiet.
The
Um,
Lord has a sense of irony.
It sure does. One of the reasons that I was so eager to talk with you, Sarah, is that you are writing and speaking about reclaiming quiet, and you are the mother of four young children.
Indeed.
Um, in fact, you just told me their ages. They are all very young. You are a well published author, you're a Substack writer, blogger, you run a vicarage with your vicar husband in Oxford, and you wrote about quiet. So I love to lean in this conversation because even though I really respect monks, you are not one. You are
Oh,
living a
yeah.
fully engaged, full life. So let's begin by you helping us understand a couple things. First, what in the world you were thinking writing on this particular topic in a very loud time of your life? And if you could even begin by setting the table to define quiet. You ask us to reclaim quiet, and I don't think you're talking about silence. Those are two different things. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. I think the narrative of how the book came to be kind of goes with my changing definitions of quiet in many ways. So, I mean, as a basis, in many ways, the book is an exploration of what quiet is. And the first thing I think I would define it as is a homecoming. I think we emerge from the word. Jesus spoke us into being. The word spoke us into being, and so we are at the very heart of ourselves a people called to be listeners. And so
Mm.
quiet is this homecoming place where we stand to listen to the voice of the God who speaks us into life. So, but I think when I first started out, I would have defined quiet more by the terms of discipline or something you do, something you attain. I began the book. I had reached kind of the end of what was another heart book. It felt like kind of a book written in my blood. It was This Beautiful Truth, which was about mental illness, my lifelong mental illness, and kind of this struggle with finding God's goodness. And I had reached the end of that, and we were in the midst of COVID, and I was pregnant with my third child, and she was very close. So my two middle ones are 18 months apart, and it was in the middle of her pregnancy, and I was quite overwhelmed. But I knew I kind of wanted to start writing, and I usually a book kind of comes to me. Usually I know what I want to write about. And
Mm.
at that phase, I mean, I was in a fairly, yeah, we were in a really deep lockdown. I was really struggling with the isolation. But I began just praying about what I wanted to write about. And I realized that what I'd been wrestling with really since the beginning of COVID was this sense that I no longer had the capacity to have interior quiet, that
Mm.
I far from silence on the outside. I could even have silence in a room, but my mind was busy. My mind raced. My imagination was galloping. I couldn't come to that still place of kind of what the psalm says of be still and know that I am God. I found that almost impossible. And I found that to be an increasingly distressing thing because I
Mm.
could no longer come to a place of peace. And I realized that in the years since the pandemic had begun, and it was a year that saw a lot of stress in my husband's work and isolation from family, and I had pneumonia for 3 months. That I had kind of come to this place where I was just scrolling as a way of coping on my phone all the time. And I began to realize what a sense of disquiet and kind of untetheredness it created in me. And so I think it was New Year's Day. I read a psalm a day, and I came to Psalm 23. And it was, you lead me by still waters, you quiet my soul. And I just said, this is what I want to learn about.
Mm.
And, I started out the book at the time thinking, what I need to figure out is how to be disciplined. I need to figure out the right things to do to be disciplined enough to bring quiet back into my life. And then followed 2 of the least quiet years I have ever known. We went
As
through the rough
it happens.
COVID. We moved twice. My husband had appendicitis. We had another
Oh,
baby. We
oh
had
my
3 deaths
gosh.
in the family, and they were the least quiet years of my life. And people would hear what I was writing about and just laugh. They were like, "You're writing about quiet. That's a good joke." And gradually, I realized. At first, I thought I must have misheard God. And then I thought, perhaps it's that I need to have a new definition of quiet. And the farther I went, the more I realized I think on a larger scale, we think of quiet as something that is for specialists, something that's for the super spiritual or the super disciplined.
The
And
monks.
actually, yeah, the monks. Exactly. That's how we
Yeah.
think of it. If
Hmm.
you're very introverted, if you're very religious, if you're maybe locked up in a commune, or perhaps just really, really you like getting up early and doing nothing for 2 hours, then you can pursue
Then it's
quiet.
for you. I don't check any one of those boxes. So,
Yeah, well, me neither. So I think gradually I realized quiet is not what I thought it was. I think quiet is something. Well, yes. So that was kind of the process. Was I think that was the shift. I can stop there if you want me to, because I could go on. But yeah,
no,
that
go
was
on,
this
go
beginning
on.
shift to realize. Okay, yeah, I think so. As I went forward, I began to realize, and the first thing, and I write about this in the book, is I was brought back to an earlier time when we had spent time in a friend's house. And that was kind of the first place I began thinking specifically about quiet. And then this was where it kind of began to foment in my brain. And in that period, I had realized I thought quiet was something I should attain. But what I found was that when I came to a moment of quiet, it waited for me like a homeland. It was a place of comfort. It was a home. And it was very much like St. Teresa says in the interior castle, the beloved was waiting for me at the heart of it. And I realized that why I crave quiet is not so that I can outdiscipline everybody else or
Mm.
have a greater spiritual state. It's so that I can come home to the voice of love. And when I kind of renewed my understanding in that way, I began to see quiet not as something we attain or a discipline we manage, as much as it is a habit of returning home.
Mm.
And that changed the whole way I understood it, because then it could become for anyone. Then it became a matter of every day turning around until you're right again, coming
Mm.
homeward, even if it's a few minutes. Then it became something that wasn't just taking things away, taking noise or activity away. It became a whole shape of life, a way of attending to the world, a way of watching people, a way of interacting with the goodness of God and recognizing his influence on every little aspect of our lives. It became a whole way of seeing and being even embodied in the world.
Mm.
And with that, I think the book came into being as it is now,
Mm.
which is, and it's very much written from the middle of everything. So,
Yeah, right. No, that's what I appreciate about it. I would have respected you if you had left your life to live abroad. I don't know how you'd swing that with 4 young children, but I wouldn't have been able to at all identify with that, because even though my kids are older, their capacity for noise is greater, if you can believe that, and more words even than the ones with which they began. And even for folks who are listening who are not in that stage of life, um, it's not helpful to me to have an entire life of retreat. I think what you are saying is, as you just beautifully put, this is the shape of a life. So I want to kind of dig into that a little bit, because you write about, spaces and places where you find quiet in front of a particular room in your house, or I mean, window in your house, places that have been important to you. But you are also saying that it's not just the first couple of minutes of the day, or even the first or the last few minutes of the day. You seem to be saying this is a cadence of your days. So I'd love for you to talk about that middle part, because you've talked about where you began and how you feel about quiet now. But for the person listening who's thinking, yeah, I would love more quiet. I would love more time to listen. I would love even to have the courage to listen. Will you talk about that? Because you write, there's this line in your book where you say you approached that listening both with fascination and with dread. And I identify with that
yeah,
initial feeling of, okay, well, now what? How do I even do that? So talk beginner style,
yeah.
newbie 1.0. Talk to us about that.
I mean, first of all, I do think there's a certain dread for many of us in quiet, because I think something I realized for myself was that I was using my iPhone very much as the Holy Spirit.
Mm,
So I came to a
mm.
point, you can ask Siri anything.
Nice.
If you're anxious, if you're afraid, if you need to know the symptoms of an illness, if you need to know which capital of a city, if you want to order anything, if you are hungry for anything,
Mhm.
Siri has all the answers,
All of them.
all of them, all the
Mhm.
time. And I realized that I was living in this way of thinking that was very disconnected from an anchor to the one who loved me.
Mm.
And when I was younger, when I actually had more time to be quiet, I remember reading a work by Brother Lawrence where he calls the practice of the presence of God.
Mm.
And I think I had that a bit in mind as I began to go forward. But the first thing is, I haven't had, well, when I first got married, I had this, and then when I first had my first daughter, I had this huge kind of renovation of my soul because I was used to the idea of a quiet time as at least an hour in the mornings by myself,
Mm.
you know, a fulfilling moment of prayer,
Mm.
some good scripture, some deep thought, and that
Amazing.
constituted a quiet time, and that made me a spiritually rooted person.
Mm.
And I had my daughter.
No. Gone.
No,
Yeah.
gone, absolutely gone.
Mm.
And I went to my spiritual director and I was like, I don't know how to get my discipline back. What do you think I should do? And I thought he was going to give me 10 works. And he's like, maybe you should choose one line of prayer and say that every morning. I was like, a line of prayer? He's like, yes, a line of prayer, one line. Or, and I write about in this book, choose a color. And every time you see that color, thank God for it. And I was kind of a little scandalized. Like, you can't really be, as my spiritual director, telling me that this is
This is
enough
your
for
answer?
life. And he was like, well, how are you doing now? Why don't you start with that? And actually, it helped me to realize another thing he helped me to realize too is there are certain, seasons we go through in life in which the old self is for a time kind of buried in the earth like a seed. And you lose a self that was in order to regain and grow something new. And so I haven't had more than about 10 minutes of quiet time in the morning for probably about 6 years.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that has astonished me and that has led to some of what I've written in the book is the realization that God has been there. I can see him at work. 2 plus 2 does not make 4. It makes much, much more than I could ask or deserve or think of. And so I think for the beginner in quiet, the first thing I would say is quiet is about coming home to the person who already loves you, who already waits to help you, who stands to receive you. We often approach it with dread because the many voices we have with our phones, this is how I was using my phone. They're what we use to medicate our worry and our fear and our sense of insecurity in a broken world. And often to step away from those things is, first of all, to step away from the noise that distracts us from looking at what is really raw in our hearts. But then we actually have to look at what is broken and what is needy and what aches at the very core of our beings. And that's a terrifying prospect
Mm.
for a while. You have to face this great darkness within yourself, but at the heart of that sits Christ.
Mm.
And at the heart of that sits love, who is waiting to draw you and tell you and help you back to a whole and healed way of being, even in this broken world. And I think quiet is the place we go to encounter God afresh. So I think having that definition in your mind first, it's not something I'm trying to prove to God. It is a homecoming to the God who already loves and provides for me. And then I think, I talk about morning and evening, and I've very much in the past 10 years kind of journeyed down a more liturgical tradition, but I see morning and evening prayer or kind of times of quiet as these touch points. This is not, you don't have to have hours anymore. I've decided what they are for me as a coming home is just turning around again. It is that cadence, like you said.
Mm.
But I think when we kind of set the cadence of our lives by seeing each moment that is, when you have a moment alone, this is a return to a place of belovedness. Then it begins to shape the way you see all minutes and the way you experience time. In a sense, it reorients your experience of space and time altogether. So you begin to see minutes and hours as places where you might encounter God and his goodness rather
Mm.
than something you dread or something that is passing and threatening or a place of anxiety. It becomes a space that can be kind of filled and made afresh. And I think the Holy Spirit comes into those spaces very much as he does in the void in Genesis and speaks new life into them when we stand and wait in the quiet. I know that's very abstract and very kind of, you know,
No, that it's actually very invitational because
yeah.
I think that I've many times gotten confused with that and thought that I initiate prayer or to initiate time with Jesus I'm the one initiating. Lord, I'm going to call this meeting to order, which is A, arrogant,
Yes.
and B, faulty in my thinking. It's more of a returning, as you say, to a conversation that's already in progress. I just stepped out of the room. He did not need me to be like, hello, over here, come here. But that I seriously think that that's how I have approached prayer and quiet many times in my life. Like, because I've decided this is the go time,
Yes.
now I will experience the presence of God, as opposed to I am in the presence of God.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to remember and come
Yes.
home
Going
to
to
the
be
idea
in.
that I'm in the presence of God. It's very different. That's a very
It
different
is.
posture.
It's very different. And then I think what grows from that, then the practical kind of the shape of quiet, is eventually realizing in order to cultivate this place of standing in the presence of God, of remembering myself there, I do kind of have to create a shape of life in which I'm attending to it.
Mm.
And that means, for me, I think I realized at some point, limit is something that I have
That's
to
my
embrace.
next question. I'm so excited. Talk about that because you talk about how you don't think that this is a coincidence that in the time of that we despise limits, right? An
Yeah.
era of just my I was just talking with a friend this weekend about this. He has a very demanding job
Mm.
and his own superior and he himself for the people who work under him, there's no real begin or end time.
Ooh.
Email is constant. So you talked about your phone. For me and my work, it's email. And just I have access to that all the time. People email me at 3 a.m. and they are not in a different time zone because they can. And I
Yeah.
think about my grandparents or my parents, they finished their work
Yeah.
and they were done with their work. People didn't come to my house at
Yeah.
10 o'clock and say, excuse me, I need to talk to your dad about,
Oh,
payroll tomorrow. But we definitely have that. It's just this constant intrusion. And so you make a very powerful case that our limitless or even our despising of limits coincides with a skyrocketing of anxiety and depression and other things that are plaguing us.
yeah.
And I loved the chapter on limits. You begin by saying, really, our very first problem was the snake saying to Eve, really? Are you sure? You don't love limits, do you? The beginning was the lie, and we're still nodding our heads and saying, you're right, I hate limits. But you say there is a miracle and a beauty in limits. So please tell us about this because it's a life changer.
Well, I think limit is the thing we have despised from the garden. You're exactly right. It's the thing we're tempted with because we hear limit in our time, particularly. I think humans throughout all the ages have heard limit as we want. It's a censoring of you. It's a
Right.
it's a keeping in. It's a caging of your capacity. But we also, in the modern age, we live in an age of radical individualism. So
Yes.
this idea that we come to happiness and fulfillment through the total expression of ourselves, no limits. We want to enact our power upon the world. The only obstacle to your growth is yourself.
Hmm.
Push yourself harder. We live in an age conditioned by machines, and we increasingly use the language of machinery to describe ourselves.
Mm.
My sister has
Mm.
written about this in a book. We use terms like we process things. That's a technical word. We use
Totally.
the ideas of so the internet never sleeps. Technology is not embodied. So we increasingly live lives conditioned by bodiless, limitless machines and
Mhm.
technologies that try to make us forget that we are embodied, fragile, finite, and beloved creatures, but that it is only in accepting and embracing those limits that we will be able to flourish and grow because we aren't limitless. We don't have endless capacity. And I think when we try to attain all of our desires and do all the work and answer the emails at 3 a.m. And that's the thing. I mean, my husband and I have talked so often about this very thing. What is this strange idea that we should respond to emails, texts, notifications at 2 a.m. in the morning when we just
No,
happen to wake up and see the phone? I mean, why should we
no,
have phones by our bedtimes to begin with?
no. Get him out of that.
Um, it's a very dehumanizing living force, but it also means we don't rest.
Right.
And rest is integral to what it means
Mhm.
to be like God. God rested. If
Yeah.
God rested, we do need to rest as well. But central to that then is also in rest and limit, we remember that we did not make ourselves, that our lives are given to us, and only in trust of the one who made us can we come to fullness. But there's this different kind of limitless life that comes when you live a life of embracing limit and trusting in the limitless goodness of God. It's very different from trying to keep up with the whole world. When you say, God, you are the maker and you are the provider of my life, and you stand in this quiet place and say, I have open hands. What will you do? What will you grow? What would you have me do? It's a very different kind of total possibility.
Mm.
It's very different from trying to outperform the world.
Yes. Before we leave, I want to pivot a little bit in just a second. Before we leave the idea of gathering those limits to us and holding them with respect,
Yeah.
moments in our day, you talk about the bookend of morning and evening. I would love just a beat here where we talk very practically about resources that have helped you do that. So you mentioned the Book of Common Prayer. I have been
Yeah.
indulging in my not a very clueless way with the book. I'm pretty sure I'm using it wrong, but it's been
I
great.
don't
What
know that
I'm
you can. I don't know that you can use it wrong. That's the fun.
I don't know. I'm probably super offensive. But I've loved every moment holy through the last
Yeah.
years. I love this app called, I think it's Lectio 3.
Yeah.
Is
Those
that
are
right?
all, I think, along the lines of this. Yeah.
Right. Just being able to have these moments that are helpful, giving me language
Yeah.
before I even have language in the morning or at the end of the day when I'm out of language. What are some other things for you that have been? This is a very didactic question. This is a very much like, what are the things you're
For the practical
holding?
things. Yep.
Yes.
So my first kind of encounter with morning and evening prayer before I became super liturgical and moved way up the candle, as my husband would say,
Moved
was
way up the candle?
uh-huh.
That's an awesome phrase because you grew up in a very different tradition and now
I
you
did. I
are
grew up
in
in
the
a lot, which I
vicarage.
greatly prized, a
Yes.
evangelical background in America. And I took such riches from that. But I have found also a huge amount. I feel like I have a rooted home for all that I brought from my childhood
Mm.
in this more liturgical tradition. But the first kind of exposure I had to morning and evening prayer was through, it's called the Northumbria Community, and they have a book called Celtic Daily Prayer. And I got it as a free copy at some book fair somewhere. And
Wonderful.
so the Northumbria community is actually built on kind of one of the ancient holy sites in Scotland, where there was a monastery, hundreds of years ago, and they have kind of restarted up.
Mm.
They created a community there, and they've written their own liturgy of Celtic morning and evening prayer based on a
Okay.
lot of the Celtic prayers that have been collected over the years. And that was just a very simple. I love it to this day. It's what my mind go to. You just say in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit.
Mm.
And one thing I've asked of the Lord, this I will seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to seek him in his temple and to behold his beauty. And so I've kind of been internalizing those words since I was about
Mhm.
16 or 17. It's a very simple liturgy. So I think with morning and evening prayer, you just begin. I have, on a personal level, I read one psalm a day and a bit of scripture. And if I have time, a bit of a spiritual book or theology or a poem, depending on how much
Mhm.
time I have, which is never very much right now. Um, so I often use things like during Advent and Lent. I use things like Malcolm Guite's. He does a
Mm.
poem a day with a meditation that goes with it. I use a lot
Mhm.
of resources like that. I think Advent and Lent can be really special times, even if you aren't particularly liturgical or from that tradition. It's a very easy kind of liturgical act to practice,
Right.
even if it's not in your
Mhm.
church, because and they can be kind of focused seasons where you can kind of taste that. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of yeah. I often publish. It's not currently up, but I will put it on my Substack soon. A list of Advent resources, because I really
Mm.
think that's a really good. That was kind of one of the first places I began to experience a sense of shaping my time by
Right.
prayer. And then too, I think to help me think about it, I mean, this is going back to more theory, but um, years ago I did because I loved the Celtic daily prayer so much. When I finally got to Wycliffe Hall at 30 years old, I didn't start my degree until I was 30. My husband likes to tease me about this in the best possible way. But so I wanted to find
Okay, husband. Okay, vicar.
out.
Get scrappy with him. I have some words
Oh,
about
believe
that,
me.
but I'm
I
sure you are. I'm sure you
I
give it
quickly
back.
learned that, teasing is the sixth love language from the Netherlands. He's from the Netherlands. So
Oh my gosh, I love it so much. My
so
family's all Dutch, but I only know bad words in Dutch at this point.
Yeah, so I had an optional paper and I got to study like how did the Celtic church come by its prayers. And one of the things that really struck me in the research I did was this one writer who said that they saw, as many ancient Christians did, they saw time in a different way than we do. So
Mm,
we see time as kind of this collection, this marching minutes and hours. It's kind of unshaped. It's going towards death. It's not particularly shaped.
mm,
They saw time as because Christ came and invaded time, all of time was now tethered to his life. So the church year was very much about living the life of Christ every year. So you
wow.
go through the year, and
Wow.
each season and each holiday is a remembrance of my life is now tethered to the life of Christ, so that all of time is now caught up in this story that is tending towards redemption. So that to me is like with morning and evening prayer, that's what I'm doing. I'm tethering my life to the story of redemption, these little moments, these little prayers, and with the words I'm saying, because there's a lot of research on how the language we use shapes our experience of the
Mm,
world. So we think of just talking about the world as something we do, but actually we've received so much language, and when we receive these prayers, we're receiving a way of seeing the world,
hmm.
and we pray these in company with people for thousands of years,
Right.
shaping the whole of our stories by saying, "This is the story I'm a part of. This is what I'm joining." And I've now tethered my whole day to this morning and evening of giving my hours and my time into the hands of God, who will now make a new story out of it.
So great. Speaking of our own personal story, I would love to talk just a little bit about you write beautifully, candidly about your experience with mental illness in your
Mm,
20s. You mentioned it earlier in this conversation. You your particular battle was with OCD and
yeah,
anxiety, and I've walked with many people actually very close to me who've walked that particular road as well as depression and other dark nights.
yeah,
And first, I just want to thank you for writing about this, for choosing to lean in instead of
mm,
away from this. It is a gift to your reader, it is a gift to us. So thank you for doing that. Maybe
thank
it
you.
cost you, maybe it didn't, but it's a beautiful gift to us.
Thank you.
Um, and then, second, I'd just love for you to speak to any listener right now who is in this moment facing heartache or
Mm,
disappointment with God in
mm,
mental illness or apart from mental illness, betrayal of what they thought their life would be right now.
yeah,
Maybe his voice feels very silent. If
yeah,
they're still with us in this conversation and haven't turned us off, because that can be very, very disorienting, especially if you have felt like you've had a
yeah,
faith practice or heard the voice of God and now he is not talking to you. Can you speak into that? I think you have a particular tenderness that can reach across the
yeah.
mic into those exhausting days.
I think the first thing I would say is that God is with you and he grieves with you. I think so often we look to find meaning and a logical outcome, or to see what God is doing in our lives. And God is not doing, God is grieving. He's holding.
Mm,
He is there. And his answer to darkness is to go into it himself and to take it all into his own body and being. And so I think the first thing I would say, and it's the thing I needed to know the most, is that the darkness is not something I needed to learn something from. It was a place where Christ came to save me.
mm,
He is at work in his goodness. He is the God. I'm a Tolkien nerd, but this is what I return to again and again. In the books of Tolkien, the king who returns is known because his hands are the hands of a healer. The hands of a king are the hands of a healer. And that is how we know Christ, not because he is the most powerful, not because he's the biggest, not because he demands our submission and discipline, but because he's the one who comes to heal us. And I think that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing is hold on to beauty. Whenever it comes to you, take it as the promise of God. I think for such a long time, I didn't know that I could trust. I struggled with knowing who God was. And I had all these people saying, well, you just need to just wait it out and figure out what God's trying to teach you. And I thought, what does he want to teach me by a brain that has this kind of horror in it? There is nothing
mm,
to be gained from this. But at the same time, I would have encounters with starlight on the mountains where I lived and walked in Colorado when I was a 16, 17-year-old kid. Um, I read Lord of the Rings and I read this story about lightness and dark contending and these little people who made desperate choices to be brave, and that meant everything. And the whole story turned on their defiant, small, desperate little choices. And that gave me an image of what it meant to choose to hold on. I would listen to music, and it would sing to me about something beyond my pain. For a minute, I could glimpse beyond the darkened horizons of my mind. I could glimpse something beautiful. And I would say to anyone in a dark place, trust those moments. That is
Mm,
God reaching into your darkness. He is invading it. He is drawing you forward into light, and He is the God of beauty. He is beauty in Himself, and He will come to heal and save, and He's there with you.
mm. Thank you for that. That's a benediction, I feel. But I have one more question for you. You mentioned that you're a Tolkien nerd,
Oh, yes.
which I appreciate. I live with one as well. And you, I mean, you, first of all kudos because you mentioned all sorts of fiction pieces that have been heartening to you. And as a fiction girl, I really appreciate that. C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Marilyn Robinson, George
That's
MacDonald, all of these greats that have not just entertained, but really kind of steeped themselves in the way that you think. And so thank you for that. I think there's a different kind of, as you say, holy attention that we can find from fiction. But on your own nightstand, Sarah Clarkson, this is our final question we ask all of
okay.
our guests. And by we, I mean me. I'm the only one here. I would like to ask you, it's a two-parter.
Okay.
I'm so curious about what people are reading. I just always find that's such a fascinating little window into what's going on. So, what's going on in the vicarage? Two-parter. A
Okay.
book that you recommend over and over. You talked about Malcolm Guite's poetry, and so we'll have all of that in the show notes. But anything else that you recommend over and over, just like a tried and true battered copy that you would love to talk about, and then also if there's anything on your list that you want to read next that you
Mhm.
have not yet read. I anticipate
Ooh.
with four young children that will happen in 2032. You will finish that title, but anything on the horizon. So, what's
Okay.
on the nightstand?
Okay. So on the nightstand, let me think. Hannah Coulter by Wendell Berry. I've been told I'm a Wendell Berry fanatic. I
Okay.
was I basically argued for Wendell Berry. I was supposed to write a paper on Dostoevsky and incarnation, and I went to my direction. I was like, I really want to write about Wendell Berry and incarnation. And he's like, who is this American farmer? Isn't he an anarchist or something? I was like, no, he's not an anarchist. I want to write a paper about it. So I wrote a
Wendell
paper
Berry, an
and
anarchist. Listen, I took a whole class on Dostoevsky in college. I mean, we read every single thing, and I think you made a good choice if you landed
well, thank
Dostoevsky.
you.
But he
I
can't. It's a different vibe. So
it
Ann
is.
Coulter, right?
Yes,
Annie
so Hannah
Coulter,
Coulter.
Ann,
Hannah
Hannah. I can't
Coulter.
remember the first name. Okay,
So
Hannah
I
Coulter,
think
Wendell Berry.
it's so Wendell Berry is what is called an agrarian writer, which just means he's a farmer who writes. And
Right.
he's from Kentucky. And he was kind of this really gifted, fated young author in the 60s. He had fellowships. He went over, I think he was on a Guggenheim Fellowship in Rome. I think he had kind of this glorious career ahead of him, and he was about to be tenured at NYU. And he looked around him at this world that he just felt was unraveling. He saw
Mm,
families come apart. He felt like there's, farms were dying, towns were dying, and he thought, the most radical thing I can do is move home to Kentucky and be faithful to my one piece of land and farm this well. And he has this real idea of fidelity that we change the world by our faithfulness
mm,
to this person, this place. That he has someone who thinks they'll be a better person somewhere else. You're always going to be trying to go somewhere else. So he has greatly formed me. And his book, Hannah Coulter, it is just the tale of a Kentucky housewife. It's told in her very simple voice. A friend of mine was like, "You may not read this book, Sarah, until you're in a quiet place because you need to savor it." And I was
oh,
like, wow, okay. But then I got it because you do
yeah.
just need to savor Hannah's writing. And there's a cadence and the lilts to her writing, but there's a depth to it. And there's a passage where she talks about her fiance coming back from the Second World War. And he basically talks about how he came back from war and out of war to build something that was the opposite war. And she said, there are places in this world that can be opposite to war. And the whole book is is really about what it means to live a life of embodied incarnate love, to
Mm,
tether our lives to the life of heaven. But it's told in the most ordinary, earthy terms. It's not highfalutin to put it in
right.
the
Oh, I've
way.
heard only wonderful things about that book.
But
That's
that is one
beautiful.
I recommend over and over and over.
Okay.
What am I looking forward to read? I'm always on the hunt for new books. What do I have right now? I mean, total honesty, I'm about to read Lord of the Rings again because it's been several years, and it's the
Oh my
autumn.
gosh, you're proving your nerd factor.
No, I'm
A
such a nerd. I finished the
reread.
Silmarillion for the fourth time last year, so I feel
Oh,
like
you're one of those.
I'm one of
I
those.
mean,
I
you
know.
did. I knew a woman once who named all of her children after the most obscure people in that. What's it called? The Silmarillion?
The Silmarillion, yes.
Silmarillion? And she spoke Elven. No, she didn't.
Well,
She wanted to.
I
You're
will.
one of those,
Should I
Sarah.
tell you that Samuel, our second, is somewhat named after Sam Gamgee, and Eleanor's name is spelled Elanor because that's Sam Gamgee's daughter.
I
I
like it
am
that
one
when
of
you
those.
confessed that you did not make eye contact with me. That's fantastic. You're a real deal Tolkiener. You're in a
Um,
wonderful place. Do you go to the pub? What's the pub? Didn't the pub close down
it
where
closed
the
down, but it's
Inklings used?
opening back up.
Okay, so
The
you
bird and the
know.
baby, the eagle and child. But there's also
Okay.
the land and flag across the street, which my husband prefers because they have good draft Belgian beer, which he tells me
Okay.
as a Dutchman is way better than the English stuff.
Oh, this is amazing. I go to Target, but you go to the place where CS and
Well,
JR are hung out.
it is
Very
the land of
similar.
pubs. Our newest
Very.
close one is the Slow and Steady, which is just up the road. I haven't tried it yet.
I
It just
just,
opened.
this is so amazing.
A book I read it once, but I'm going to read it again, and I'm really excited about it. I feel like one reading was not enough, and now I'm going to make everybody in my book fellowship read it as well. It's Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. So I'll
Okay.
say that's what I'm really looking forward to reading again and haven't really read yet.
Okay.
Um, I'm looking
I
very
can see
forward.
you trying to pull it back here, trying to pull it back from
You
JRR,
know
but
what?
it's okay. We already went there.
You
We'll
know what?
list that book
Just
as well.
well, I feel like my children should just be glad I didn't name one of them Aragorn. I did seriously consider
You
Arwen.
say you listen, there are worse things. Or Gandalf. That'd be hard in kindergarten.
I'd be a little hard on a kid. I feel
Gandalf,
like that's just
Gandalf,
not
come to the front of the room.
quite.
Feels like middle school's hard enough. Let's not do that. Sarah Clarkson, thank you so much for your time for this exquisite book. You just mentioned you're going to reread. This is a rereader for me. I kept
Oh,
putting it down and saying to Mark, my husband, I am going to have to reread. I'm going to start all the way over and start again. I have written in this, and I'm very weird about writing in books, but I couldn't help it. I had to write all through because there were so many
okay.
beautiful treasures to take with me. So thank you for that. I hope you sell a gazillion copies, and I hope your coverage of your book is even more salient. Well, I know it is, and more exciting than our election coverage. That is my hope for you.
It will be very quiet. That's all I can promise.
I love it. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.